She only wanted to cover for her careless sister on one blind date, but instead Ava Bennett found herself trapped in the stormy gaze of a ruthless millionaire CEO, and one whispered word from his silent daughter would change her life forever. Ava, Ava Bennett had never thought of herself as the kind of woman who would agree to impersonate her sister. She was practical, grounded, and too busy working two jobs to even think about blind dates, much less show up at one under someone else's name. But when Emma sent the frantic text, "Please, Ava, cover for me. I can't go. You're the only one I trust," Ava caved. It was supposed to be simple. Sit for half an hour, excuse herself politely, and disappear. Nobody would remember her face. Nobody would care. She told herself that over and over as the elevator carried her up to the rooftop restaurant, but her heart still hammered, like it was trying to escape her chest. The moment the glass doors opened, she realized how badly she had underestimated the situation. This was no casual meeting over coffee. The restaurant gleamed with crystal chandeliers suspended like frozen rain, tables dressed in white linen, and the hush of wealth all around. And then she saw him, sitting at the table near the terrace, framed by the city skyline and the restless pulse of storm clouds gathering overhead. A man in a tailored charcoal suit that looked as though it had been cut to his frame alone. Dark hair combed back, a sharp jawline, and eyes the color of rich whiskey that seemed to take in everything at once. For a second she froze. She had seen that face before, though not in person, on magazine covers, in online articles that mentioned corporate takeovers and multi-million-dollar deals. Ethan Hale, CEO of Hale and Rowan. The kind of man who lived in a different universe entirely, one where power was currency and charm was weaponized. And she was standing there in a dress borrowed from Emma's closet, praying it didn't look as cheap as it had felt when she'd zipped it up. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but his gaze intent. "Emma?" he asked. His voice was calm, controlled, but a shadow of doubt flickered across his features, as if he already knew something didn't add up. Ava swallowed. She could lie, but the thought of those eyes pinning her down while she spun a story made her skin crawl. "Almost," she admitted, forcing her voice not to tremble. "I'm Ava. I came..." Instead of her, something shifted in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe irritation, but not the explosion she'd braced for. He gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit." It wasn't a question. Her instincts screamed to turn and leave, to run before this spiraled further out of control, but she forced herself into the seat, her palms damp against the leather menu. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the muted clink of cutlery from other tables. Finally, he leaned back, studying her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. "You came here pretending to be your sister?" he asked, his voice low but carrying weight. "Not pretending," she said quickly. "She asked me to cover for her. I thought it would be easier than saying no. I didn't expect..." She glanced around at the opulence, then back at him. "This." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it never reached his eyes. "Easier," he repeated like the word amused him. Then he set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "You don't strike me as the kind of woman who does anything the easy way." The storm outside cracked, thunder rolling across the city. Ava startled slightly, but Ethan didn't move. He simply watched her, and she had the sudden, unnerving impression that he could see past the dress, past the awkwardness, straight into the parts of herself she never let anyone examine. "I should go," she said abruptly, pushing back her chair. But before she could take a step, the restaurant manager appeared, pale and apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir, miss. The storm has temporarily shut down the elevators. Safety protocol. We'll need a little time before they're operational again." Ava's breath caught. She turned toward the exit, but the guard by the doors shook his head and blocked the way. Panic sparked in her chest until she realized Ethan hadn't looked surprised at all. He murmured something to the manager, who disappeared instantly. Then those steady brown eyes returned to her. "Looks like we're stuck here a while," he said, voice as smooth as velvet. "You might as well stay. Dinner is better than pacing by the door." She hesitated, but her stomach, hollow from a 12-hour shift, betrayed her by twisting painfully. With a quiet sigh, she lowered herself back into the chair. "Just until the storm clears." His lips curved. Not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. "Of course. Let's start with honesty then. Why would you risk this farce for your sister? Her fingers tightened around the stem of the wine glass he had ordered for her. The truth pressed at her chest, dangerous and humiliating. But there was something in the way he asked. Not cruel, not mocking, but direct, that made lying impossible. So she told him about her mother's endless medical bills, about working night shifts and day shifts just to keep the lights on, about Emma's casual recklessness that always seemed to land squarely on her shoulders. When she finished, she expected judgment. Instead, Ethan's expression had softened almost imperceptibly, the edges of his steel-hard composure blurred. "So you came to shield her," he said, even when it meant walking straight into a stranger's scrutiny. "Even when it meant this," she echoed, lifting her glass with shaky fingers. Another crash of thunder shook the windows. She jumped, but Ethan didn't so much as flinch. His gaze stayed locked on her, unrelenting and strangely warm. "Don't rush off," he said quietly. "It seems we have more in common than you think." And for the first time all evening, Ava felt the ground shift beneath her. Not from the storm raging outside, but from something far more dangerous unfolding at the table between them. The storm lingered over the city, heavy and unrelenting, and with it lingered the conversation that Ava had sworn she would never have with a man like Ethan Hale. She had imagined silence, awkwardness, a polite dismissal, but what she found instead was a strange sort of gravity between them, pulling her further into words she hadn't realized she carried. She told him about numbers and patterns, how she loved statistics because numbers never lied, how they gave her order when her world was chaos. She admitted she hated depending on anyone, because depending meant disappointment. Every confession seemed to fall out of her before she could stop it, and the more she spoke, the more intently he listened. Ethan didn't interrupt. He asked a question here or there, not with the sharp tone of interrogation, but with the steadiness of someone accustomed to getting full answers. It unnerved her, how he looked at her when she spoke, not as though she were a poor substitute for her sister, not as though he were humoring her, but as though she was relevant. And that was more dangerous than his power or wealth, because relevance made her feel exposed. When the plates were cleared, when the storm still showed no sign of abating, he leaned back in his chair, studying her in silence. She resisted the urge to fidget under that gaze. But then he spoke, and his words unraveled her already frayed nerves. "I need something from you," he said simply. Ava's eyes widened. "From me?" He nodded. "Yes. A role. Temporary. A performance, if you like." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was steel beneath it. "In 2 days, I have a critical meeting with an investor. Old-fashioned, conservative, obsessed with the appearance of stability. He doesn't trust men who live like shadows, men without roots. He wants to see family, connection, proof that I'm more than a lone wolf chasing profit. And I intend to give him that." The words sank in slowly, and Ava's pulse picked up with every beat. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?" His mouth twitched, the hint of a smirk tugging at the edges, but his voice remained steady. "I want you to attend a dinner. Sit beside me, smile when necessary. Nothing more. You're sharp enough to handle a table of executives, and you're not dazzled by wealth, which makes you less likely to embarrass either of us. It's a business arrangement, nothing else," she laughed, though the sound cracked at the edges. "Do you hear yourself? Do you even realize how this sounds?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Like a transaction. And I know how that must sound to you. But I'm offering you terms, not illusions." Her fingers tightened around her napkin. "So you're buying me?" His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in quiet defiance. "No, I'm asking for your help. And I will compensate you fairly for it. Enough to make a difference in the very bills and debts you just confessed are bearing you. Enough to give you room to breathe. This isn't about ownership. It's about partnership. For one evening." The air between them grew taut, charged more heavily than the storm outside. Ava wanted to be furious, to spit out that she wasn't for sale, but the truth hit her like a blade. Her mother. Her mother who was running out of time, who had sent her another pleading text only last night about the mounting medical fees. The world had been giving her no choices for months, only burdens. And here he was, handing her an option wrapped in sharp edges. You think I can be bought because I admitted I'm drowning? She said, her voice low, trembling with a mix of pride and fear. I think, Ethan countered, that you are a woman who sacrifices for everyone else and leaves herself with nothing. I think you deserve to breathe. And I think you're smart enough to see this for what it is. A chance. You don't owe me affection. You don't owe me anything beyond one evening of civility. I keep my word, Ava. Always, her name on his lips sent a strange shiver down her spine. He said it differently than most. Firm, like he was claiming the syllables as his own, yet not in a way that felt like theft. She dropped her gaze to the tablecloth, tracing the faint pattern with her fingertip. Stalling, fighting against the part of her heart that whispered how easy it would be to say yes. Pride battled with desperation, dignity with survival. She wanted to believe she was stronger than temptation, but she could almost see her mother's face, pale under hospital lights. She knew the deposit was due. She knew there was no other way to cover it in time. I need to think, she said finally, forcing her voice steady. Of course. His response was immediate, calm. He didn't press. He simply finished his drink, set the glass down, and signaled for the bill with the ease of a man who controlled not only his world, but everyone else's. The storm finally began to ease, and with it, the restaurant manager returned to tell them the elevators were working again. Ava rose, and Ethan stood as well, adjusting his cufflinks as though the evening had been nothing more than routine. But before she could leave, he said one last thing, his gaze locking onto hers with unnerving intensity. You have until tomorrow night. Then I need an answer. She stepped into the elevator, heart racing. The doors closed between them, but his voice, low and steady, seemed to follow her into the night. An offer, a demand, a temptation. She swore she wouldn't say yes. She swore she wouldn't sell herself. And yet when her phone buzzed at 2 in the morning with a hospital message, deposit needed immediately, cannot proceed without payment, Ava knew her decision had already been made. At sunrise, with shaking hands, she dialed Ethan's number. When his deep voice answered, calm and expectant, she whispered the words she had never thought she'd say. I'll do it, but not as Emma. As Ava. The city was still wet from the storm the night before when Ava climbed into Ethan's sleek black car the following afternoon. She told herself she was ready, that this was just a role she had agreed to play, a mask she could put on and take off without consequence. But the moment the tinted door closed behind her and she felt the hum of the engine beneath her chest tightened. She wasn't just stepping into a stranger's life for one evening. She was stepping into his world, and she had no idea what awaited her there. Ethan didn't speak at first. He sat beside her, one arm resting easily on the leather seat, his gaze fixed out the window, as if considering something only he could see. The silence pressed in, thick and expectant, until he finally turned his head. Before tomorrow, he said, there's someone you should meet. Ava blinked. Someone? My daughter, he replied simply. Lily. The word landed like a weight in her lap. Daughter. She hadn't imagined him as a father. Ethan Hale, CEO, ruthless negotiator, man with an empire at his feet. She could picture him surrounded by boardrooms and reporters, but not bedtime stories or small shoes by the door. Yet the way he said her name, softened, reverent almost, told Ava more about him than any article ever could. The drive wound through quiet, manicured streets until they reached a house that stood in sharp contrast to the glass towers Ethan usually occupied. It wasn't ostentatious, though it was certainly large. Wide windows let in generous light, ivy curled across pale stone walls, and a porch swing moved lazily in the breeze. It looked lived in, safe. Inside, the air carried a warmth Ava didn't expect. The faint scent of vanilla and lavender, shelves crowded with books, and a scattering of toys near the base of the stairs betrayed the presence of a child. She was still drinking in the details when she heard soft footsteps overhead. And then she saw her, a little girl, 5 maybe, with a tumble of chestnut hair and eyes so dark they seemed to anchor her entire face. She wore fox-printed pajamas, clutching a stuffed rabbit by one ear. She paused on the landing, staring down at Ava with a gaze far older than her years, cautious and quiet. Ethan's entire body changed the moment he looked at her. The steel edge that seemed permanently etched into his features softened into something fragile, almost tender. This is Lily, he said, his voice different. lower, gentler, as though he were speaking into a secret. She's 5. She hasn't spoken much this past year, after his words faltered, cutting off before grief could rise to the surface. Ava's heart squeezed. She crouched slowly, careful not to startle the little girl. "Hi, Lily," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that she hadn't realized was in her. "I'm Ava. I'm kind of scared of thunderstorms. Are you?" For a long, breathless moment, Lily just watched her, her expression unreadable. Then shyly she nodded. Ava reached for a napkin from the nearby table, tearing it into strips with quick, practiced motions. She folded the paper carefully, creasing it into a small fox, its pointed ears crooked but endearing. She held it out on her palm. "Want to try making one?" Something flickered across Lily's face, a spark of curiosity, tentative but alive. She patted down the steps, small bare feet silent against the wood, and stopped just in front of Ava. Her fingers brushed the paper fox, light as a feather. And then, barely audible, as if the word had been hiding in her chest for months, she whispered, "Ava." The sound was so soft it might have been imagined, but it struck Ava like thunder. She froze, eyes wide, unsure if she had truly heard it. But then she looked up and saw Ethan. He had gone utterly still, his eyes locked on his daughter, and for the first time, the polished armor he wore cracked. Raw emotion glistened in his gaze. His throat worked like he was forcing back years of silence and sorrow. He turned quickly, facing the wide window, as though unwilling to let Ava see him undone. But she saw. She saw everything. She reached out, brushing a gentle hand across Lily's hair. "That was beautiful," she whispered, her heart aching with wonder. "Do you want to keep the fox?" Lily nodded, clutching the little folded paper animal to her chest as if it were treasure. Then in a movement so small it almost broke Ava's heart, she leaned into Ava's arm, pressing close. Ethan cleared his throat, steadying himself, and when he turned back, his composure had mostly returned, but not entirely. His eyes still carried the shine of a man who had been caught unguarded, who had glimpsed something he thought lost forever. "Stay for dinner," he said. It wasn't an order this time. It was quiet, almost vulnerable. Ava hesitated. This wasn't the plan. She wasn't supposed to blur lines, wasn't supposed to step into roles that weren't hers. But then Lily's small hand slipped into hers, warm and insistent, and Ava knew there was no way she could leave. The evening unfolded gently, almost unnaturally so for the home of a man like Ethan Hale. They ate pasta at a long wooden table. Lily perched between them, silent but content, her new fox always within reach. Ava found herself laughing softly at stories Ethan reluctantly shared. Brief glimpses of his childhood, moments of awkward parenting he confessed only because Lily tugged at his sleeve to make him. It was ordinary, achingly ordinary, and that was what made it extraordinary. For a few fleeting hours, Ava forgot about the contract, the money, the storm that had thrown her into his path. She forgot about Emma's carelessness and her mother's mounting bills. She was simply there, in a house that felt too warm for walls so grand, holding the hand of a little girl who had spoken her name as if it mattered. When Ava finally rose to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. He didn't say much, but his eyes lingered on her in a way that made her pulse quicken. Then just as she turned to step into the night, he spoke again, his voice low and uncharacteristically unsteady. "She hasn't said a word in months," he said, "not one. And tonight, she said yours." Ava swallowed hard, her throat tightening. Maybe she just needed a fox. Ethan's lips curved faintly, though his gaze was far too serious for a smile. Or maybe she needed you. And with that, he closed the door softly, leaving Ava standing on the steps with her heart caught between terror and hope, the echo of a little girl's whisper still ringing in her ears. The dinner with the investor was supposed to be a performance, but it unfolded like a script Ava had never rehearsed. She arrived at Ethan's side in a simple navy dress, her hair pinned up the way Emma had once insisted, looked too serious for Instagram. Yet in that setting, a candlelit private dining room, polished silver glinting under crystal chandeliers, she didn't feel out of place. She felt necessary. Ethan introduced her without hesitation, his hand at the small of her back like it belonged there. "This is Ava," he said, voice calm and even. He didn't add "my date" or "my girlfriend," But the implication hung naturally in the air, as though her presence beside him had never been in question. The investor, an older man with sharp eyes and the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in his suit, seemed immediately charmed. "It's good to see a man like you anchored," he said, giving Ethan a pointed look. "Business is one thing, but family, it shows character." Lily made a brief appearance too, patting in shyly with her paper fox clutched in her tiny hands. She perched for only a few minutes, long enough to smile at the investor when Ava gently coaxed her forward. The man melted instantly, his sternness evaporating as he patted her head and declared Ethan, a man who clearly had priorities straight. Ava felt Ethan's gaze brush hers then, fleeting but heavy, as though silently acknowledging she had made that moment possible. The evening ended in success. Contracts were all but promised, toast made, and when they left the restaurant together, Ethan looked almost relieved. In the car, with city lights streaming past the windows, he turned to her and said in a low, certain voice, "You did more tonight than I could have asked. Thank you, but relief never lasts long." By the time Ava returned home, her phone was already buzzing with notifications. She frowned, unlocking the screen, only to feel her stomach plunge. Headlines, photos. Her name splashed across gossip blogs. Mysterious girlfriend of Ethan Hale revealed. CEO's secret date spotted at private dinner. Someone had captured them leaving the venue, had framed the angle just right so it looked like Ethan's hand was possessive at her waist, like she was leaning into him with intimate familiarity. Her pulse raced as she scrolled. Post after post dissected her clothes, her hair, her very existence, and then came the blow that made her chest tighten until it hurt. Emma. Her sister had posted on her blog, complete with a picture of Ava taken years ago at some family gathering. The caption read, "When your sister steals your chance at the big time, imagine posing as me at a dinner you weren't even invited to." Contract relationships are sad, but betrayal? Even worse, the comments were cruel. Strangers tearing her apart with vicious words, accusing her of being a gold digger, of trapping a powerful man, of scheming to secure a future that wasn't hers. By the time she met Ethan the next morning, the damage had doubled. He stood in his office like a statue carved from marble, the city skyline sprawling behind him, his phone buzzing with unanswered calls on his desk. His eyes were darker than usual, unreadable as they fixed on her. Without a word, he held out his phone, the screen glowing with Emma's blog post. "Did you know about this?" His voice was low, deceptively calm, but beneath it simmered something sharp. Ava shook her head, her throat dry. "No, I didn't even know she'd... Ethan, I would never... She named you." She implied this entire thing is staged. He stepped closer, the tension radiating from him like heat. "Do you understand what that does to me? To my company? To my daughter?" Her breath caught. The accusation stung, not because it was unfair, though it was, but because it revealed the truth of what he feared most. That she wasn't a woman at his side, but another problem, another risk he couldn't afford. "I told her nothing," Ava insisted, desperation cutting through her voice. "She must have guessed. She, she does things like this for attention, for her followers. She didn't think about me. She never does." But Ethan's expression had hardened. The vulnerable man she'd glimpsed at his home nowhere in sight. He was CEO again, armor fully in place. "I'll handle it," he said. The words were precise, clipped. "But for now, we need distance." Her stomach twisted. "Distance?" "Yes." He adjusted his cufflinks as though the act could erase the storm between them. "You've done what I asked. You upheld your end of the deal. Now let me uphold mine. I'll ensure the payment is transferred by tomorrow." The words hit her like a slap. Payment. Transaction. He was pushing her back into the role she had tried so hard not to inhabit. And maybe it was what she deserved. Maybe it was what she had agreed to from the start. But hearing it now carved deep into her chest. Ava left without another word, her footsteps echoing too loudly against the marble floor. Outside, rain had begun to fall again. Light but insistent, speckling her dress as she refused the umbrella the driver offered. She walked home through the drizzle, her heart pounding with the cruel rhythm of Emma's betrayal, Ethan's coldness, the headlines that painted her as nothing more than a scandal. When she finally reached her small apartment, exhausted and drenched, she found her mother sitting at the table, a stack of printed screenshots spread before her. Her mother's hand trembled as she tried to cover the papers, her face pale with shame and worry. "Ava," she whispered, "what have they done to you?" Ava sank into the chair opposite her, burying her face in her hands. For the first time since she had walked into Ethan Hale's life, she wanted to vanish completely. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside her. She had thought she could play the role for one night, thought she could step into his world and then step out unscathed. But now she understood. She wasn't just entangled with Ethan. She was caught in something much larger, something that could break her heart, ruin her reputation, and destroy whatever fragile trust had been forming between them. And as thunder cracked again in the distance, Ava realized with a sick twist of fear that she no longer wanted distance. Not from Ethan, not from Lily, not from the strange warmth she had begun to feel in that house that wasn't hers. But he had asked for it, demanded it, and for now all she could do was obey. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, the kind of place where whispers seemed to cling to the walls long after the voices had faded. Ava had never stepped into a courtroom before, and yet here she was, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands as she pushed through the heavy double doors. She told herself she didn't belong here, that this was not her fight, but her heart refused to obey. She remembered Lily's small hand in hers, the soft murmur of her own name from lips that hadn't spoken in months. That whisper had bound Ava to this little girl in ways that nothing, not money, not distance, not Ethan's cold dismissal, could unravel. The hearing was about custody. Ethan's in-laws, the parents of his late wife, had filed for more time with Lily. On paper, their argument sounded reasonable. Ethan was too busy, too focused on his empire, too consumed by work to raise a child alone. But beneath their words, Ava could hear the quiet, ugly insinuation that he was unfit, that Lily would be better off without him. And to make matters worse, Emma's cruel blog post had been dragged into evidence. The opposing lawyer held up printed pages, highlighting words like contract relationship and pretending. Each syllable was designed to slice through Ethan's credibility, to paint him as a man who couldn't even keep his personal life free from a scandal. Ethan sat at the front, shoulders straight, face carved from stone. He didn't flinch when the lawyer spoke, didn't shift when the accusations grew sharper. He looked like a man who had been through battles before, who knew how to stand still while the storm tried to tear him apart. But Ava saw the truth in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands clenched once, just once, before he forced them flat on the table. He was enduring, but endurance wasn't the same as victory. When her name was called, Ava rose, heart pounding in her ears. The judge regarded her with polite curiosity, perhaps expecting another useless witness who would add little to the case. But Ava didn't tremble when she spoke. She held up her folder, documents neatly clipped inside. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the riot in her chest. "I have evidence that the blog post being presented here is not only misleading, but knowingly false." Murmurs rippled through the room. The opposing lawyer sneered, but Ava continued, unfolding the notarized statement she had brought. She had spent sleepless nights gathering it, calling in every favor she could think of. Emma had slipped, of course she had. She always slipped. And Ava had tracked down the private messages where her sister admitted the post was staged, sponsored by a brand that wanted a scandal to boost engagement. The blog had been nothing but bait for clicks, a cruel stunt with no regard for truth or consequences. She read the words aloud, each line heavier than the last, and the courtroom shifted. The judge leaned forward. The lawyer's smirk faltered, and in the corner of her vision, Ava saw Ethan's head turn toward her for the first time that day, his gaze sharp with something she couldn't name. The opposing side tried to object, but the judge silenced them with a raised hand. "This evidence is admissible," he ruled. "Proceed." Ava returned to her seat, her knees weak, but she didn't falter. She could feel Ethan's eyes still on her, burning through her composure, but she didn't dare meet them. Not yet. Then came the part of the hearing Ava hadn't expected. The judge asked whether anyone else wished to speak on Lily's behalf. The grandparents offered their rehearsed lines about love, about stability, about what a child truly needs. But when they finished, a small sound broke the tension. A chair scraped, tiny feet shuffled, and suddenly Lily was there, standing on her tiptoes at the witness stand, clutching her paper fox in one hand. No one had summoned her. She had simply risen from her seat beside the nanny, her wide eyes fixed on Ava and Ethan as if she had made up her mind. The judge hesitated, clearly torn, but before he could stop her, Lily reached for the microphone. Her little fingers curled around it, and in a voice that trembled but carried, she spoke. "I want to be with Daddy," she said. The courtroom stilled. Her eyes flicked to Ava then, shining with certainty. And, and with Ava. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the judge seemed momentarily disarmed, his gavel hovering uselessly in his hand. For a child who had not spoken in nearly a year, the words rang out like a bell, undeniable and pure. Ethan's head dropped into his hand for a moment, just a brief, unguarded second. When he lifted it again, his eyes were bright, and Ava felt her breath catch at the rawness there. He looked not at the judge, not at the grandparents, but at her, as if she had been the one to make this miracle possible, as if Lily's voice belonged to them both. The judge cleared his throat, composing himself. "Well," he said slowly, "I believe we've heard the clearest testimony of all." He scribbled a note, then announced his ruling. Custody would remain with Ethan. The grandparents would have visitation, but the court recognized the stability and bond Lily had with her father. A ripple of relief spread through the room, but Ava barely registered it. She was too focused on the small figure, clutching her hand as she returned to her seat. Lily pressed the paper fox into her palm, as though passing on a torch, and whispered just for her, "Don't go." Ava's heart nearly broke under the weight of it. When the session adjourned, Ethan rose and crossed to her. For the first time since the scandal had broken, his armor seemed cracked, his voice low and rough. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "Why would you stand here for me after everything?" Ava wanted to look away, but she didn't. "Because truth matters more than pride," she said quietly, "and because she said my name. That's not something I can walk away from." For a long moment, he said nothing. His gaze searched hers, a thousand thoughts colliding behind those steady brown eyes. Then slowly, he nodded. As the courtroom emptied, Ava realized nothing between them had been fixed. Not the scandal, not the fragile trust, not the ache of distance he had demanded, but something had shifted irreversibly. She had stood for him, for Lily, and in doing so, she had stepped deeper into their lives than she had ever intended. And though it terrified her, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't turn back now. The day after the custody hearing, the relief that had briefly settled over Ava evaporated like mist in the sun. News broke before dawn. An anonymous leak claiming Hale and Rowan had manipulated reports, falsifying financials to inflate their success. The accusations were printed in bold letters across every business feed, echoed by pundits and amplified by headlines screaming scandal. By the time Ava arrived at the office, the company's stock price had already begun to spiral, board members were in uproar, and reporters swarmed outside like vultures circling a wounded animal. Ethan was in the war room, a glass-walled conference space that looked down over the city like a throne room stripped of comfort. He stood at the head of the long, polished table, shoulders squared, his phone pressed to his ear as his assistants scrambled with printouts and laptops. His presence was calm, collected, but Ava could see the tension radiating through him, the steel-edged control of a man holding his empire together with nothing but sheer will. When he ended the call, his eyes met hers across the room. For a moment she thought he might send her away, that this was his battlefield, not hers. But then he gestured sharply for her to join him. She crossed the room, her pulse quickening under the scrutiny of his team. "Someone's moving against us," he said, his voice clipped, every syllable precise. "The numbers they've leaked are partial, selective, twisted just enough to look damning." His gaze was hard, unyielding. "But they're using the chaos from the custody hearing, from your sister's stunt, as cover." This timing isn't coincidence. Ava felt heat rise in her chest. She had known Emma's betrayal had hurt, but she hadn't imagined it would open the door to something like this. "So someone inside is feeding them information?" she murmured. "Someone who knows when you're vulnerable." His jaw tightened. "Yes, and I intend to find out who the team launched into damage control, drafting statements, fielding calls, preparing counter-narratives." But Ava's mind worked differently. She wasn't a strategist or a lawyer. She was a woman who loved numbers, who trusted patterns. While others debated wording, she asked for access to the anonymized financial logs. At first, no one paid attention. What could the CEO's supposed girlfriend know about corporate data? But Ethan silenced them with a glance and handed her the files himself. She settled at the end of the table with a laptop, heart pounding. For hours, she combed through endless spreadsheets, every column a blur of digits and dates. She traced transactions line by line, following the flow like a river, searching for anything that felt wrong. The team around her grew restless, voices rising, but Ava was lost in the quiet order of numbers. And then she saw it, a faint irregularity, almost invisible, a series of minor adjustments that appeared only during narrow windows of time, always between midnight and 1 in the morning. Tiny discrepancies just large enough to tilt the reports, small enough to vanish under casual review. But patterns never lied. She dug deeper, layering logs, cross-checking timestamps. Slowly, a name emerged from the shadows: the chief financial officer. The man seated just 3 chairs away from Ethan at every board meeting, the man who had publicly praised him while quietly reshaping the data beneath his feet. Her hands shook as she pulled the reports into a single document, highlighting the anomalies. When she finally looked up, the room was louder, hotter, a storm of voices colliding. She stood abruptly, the sound of her chair scraping cutting through the noise. "I found it," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward her. She clicked the projector, filling the wall with her findings. "Here," she said, pointing to the highlighted sequences. "Adjustments that only occur in the dead of night. Always subtle, always masked by the next day's legitimate entries. Over weeks, they create the illusion of inflated growth, and all of them trace back to one login." She tapped the screen. "Your CFO." Gas rippled through the room. The CFO himself was not present. He had called in sick, conveniently absent in the midst of chaos. Ethan's expression hardened, his jaw like stone. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence pressed heavy, suffocating. Then he turned to his team, his voice ablade. "Issue the warrant, collect every file, and prepare the press briefing. This ends tonight." The hours that followed blurred into motion. By evening, Ethan and Ava stood side by side before a wall of cameras. The press swarmed, lights blinding, questions hurled like spears. Ethan spoke first, his tone calm but unyielding, announcing the betrayal uncovered within his own ranks, the immediate suspension of the CFO, and the company's full cooperation with investigators. His authority was absolute, his confidence radiating, but when the questions turned sharper, it was Ava who stepped forward. She explained the discovery, her words precise and grounded, her love of numbers shining through every sentence. She wasn't a polished executive, but her authenticity made the reporters lean in. She spoke of anomalies, of truth buried in data, of the patterns that revealed deception. And when she finished, there was no doubt left in the room. When the cameras cut off, when the crowd dispersed, Ethan didn't speak. He only looked at her, his gaze fierce and unreadable, something dangerous and vulnerable warring in his eyes. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the restrained energy in him, the storm he had contained all day. His voice, when it came, was rougher than she had ever heard it. "You saved my company," he said, "and my family." In the same week, her throat tightened. She wanted to shrug it off, to pretend it hadn't cost her everything, but her voice betrayed her, trembling. "I just did what I know how to do." But the truth was deeper, more dangerous. She hadn't done it just because she could. She had done it because it was him, because the thought of watching him fall, of watching Lily lose more than she already had, was unbearable. And as Ethan's eyes held hers, Ava knew something had shifted beyond repair. She wasn't just playing a role anymore. She was in the center of his storm, and she didn't want to leave. The night after the press briefing, the city seemed quieter than usual, though Ava suspected the silence was an illusion. Behind the skyline's glittering towers, journalists were still writing their pieces, investors were still dissecting Ethan's every word, and enemies were still searching for cracks in his armor. But inside Ethan's penthouse, the chaos felt far away. The glass walls reflected only the dark sky and the dim golden glow of the lamps, soft and warm against the sharp edges of modern furniture. Ava stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring down at the blurred river of headlights below. She told herself she should leave, that she had already done enough. More than enough. She had defended him in court, uncovered a traitor in his company, stood beside him under a barrage of cameras. She had done all that, and still, in the back of her mind, she heard his words from before. The cold dismissal, the demand for distance. It should have been easier now to remind herself that this wasn't her life. And yet, with Lily asleep down the hall and Ethan pacing the length of the room behind her, it felt impossible to pretend she wasn't part of it. He stopped suddenly, the sound of his footsteps ceasing. She turned slowly, expecting to see the usual mask in place, but for once, his composure seemed fractured. His tie was gone, his shirt collar loosened, and his sleeves rolled back in uneven folds. More than that, his face, so carefully controlled in front of the world, was raw, as if he had finally run out of ways to contain everything he carried. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice rough. Ava blinked, surprised. "For what?" "For treating you like a liability," he answered. His gaze locked onto hers, unflinching, and the weight of it rooted her to the spot. "For pushing you away when all you've done is stand beside me. For forgetting that you're not here because of a contract or a transaction. You're here because you chose to be." Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to remind him that choice hadn't come so easily, that she had been desperate, cornered by her mother's bills and Emma's manipulation. But that would have been only part of the truth. The other part, the part she couldn't admit even to herself, was that she had stayed long after the deal was fulfilled. She had stayed for Lily. She had stayed for him. "You were right to keep your distance," she said softly. "I never should have gotten involved. I don't belong in your world." "No," he said quickly, the word cutting through the space between them. He stepped closer, his eyes burning with urgency. "That's where you're wrong. You belong here more than anyone. Do you know what I saw when you stood in front of that judge? When you tore apart that blog post? When you made Lily's voice matter? I saw the kind of strength I've spent years pretending I don't need. And tonight, when you uncovered what no one else could, when you saved everything I've built, I realized I can't keep pretending." Her heart pounded, each beat a sharp echo against her ribs. "Pretending what?" "That I don't need you," he said. His voice was low but steady, each word deliberate. "I control everything, Ava. Every deal, every move, every number, every word I allow the world to see. But when it comes to you, I can't control a damn thing. And it terrifies me." The confession hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. Ava's breath caught, her chest tight with emotions she didn't want to name. For so long she had trained herself not to hope, not to believe that anyone could look at her and see something worth holding on to. Yet here he was, a man who had everything, telling her she was the one thing he couldn't master. "I was scared too," she whispered, her voice trembling but honest. "Scared to let someone in who could walk away at any moment. I've spent years protecting myself from that. But Lily, she didn't give me a choice. She walked right past my walls, and once she was in, you were too." Ethan's expression softened, the tension in his face shifting into something almost reverent. He closed the distance between them slowly, as though giving her time to retreat. But Ava didn't move. She couldn't. His presence wrapped around her like gravity, pulling her closer with every step. "Then let's stop running," he said quietly. "No more deals. No more pretending this is temporary. No more bargains where I offer money and you offer time. Let's choose each other. Every day. You, me, and Lily." Together her eyes burned with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach for that fragile, impossible promise. But a lifetime of disappointment screamed for caution. "And if you change your mind? If one day I'm not enough, or this becomes inconvenient?" He shook his head sharply, silencing her. Then, almost reluctantly, he slipped a hand into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. It wasn't extravagant, not the sort of gaudy statement she might have expected from a man of his wealth. The box was simple, understated, worn at the edges, as though it had been waiting for the right moment. He opened it, revealing a ring with a single piece of amber, glowing warm and golden beneath the light. "I've been carrying this for months," he admitted. "Not for you, at least not at first. I bought it because it reminded me of Lily, the color of her lashes when she falls asleep in the sun. I didn't know what I'd do with it or why I held on to it, but now I do. I want to give it to you, not because it proves anything to investors or silences the world, because it's the only thing I've ever wanted to give for no reason other than love. Ava's hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching painfully. Tears blurred her vision, spilling hot down her cheeks. Ethan, marry me, he said, his voice breaking for the first time she had ever heard. Not for appearances, not for convenience, for us, for her, for everything we've already become. Her laugh came out as a sob, shaky and full of disbelief. You don't even know what you're asking. You don't know what you're taking on. I do, he interrupted, his tone fierce. I know you, and I know I don't want to face a single storm without you. The silence that followed was fragile, a breath held between hope and fear. Then Ava exhaled, the sound trembling, and nodded. Yes, she whispered, the word tasting like both surrender and salvation. Yes, but we need to ask Lily first. She deserves to choose, too. Ethan smiled then, a real smile, unguarded and brilliant. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and together they walked down the hall to the small bedroom where Lily slept. The little girl stirred when they entered, her eyes blinking open, wide and drowsy. She sat up, clutching her fox, and peered at them curiously. Ava crouched by the bed, her voice soft. Lily, your daddy asked me something very important. He asked me to marry him, but I told him we have to ask you first. Because your voice matters most? Lily blinked at her, then at Ethan, then back again. For a moment, Ava feared the weight of the question was too much for a 5-year-old to understand. But then Lily smiled, solemn and radiant, and nodded. Let's be a family, she said simply. And with those 4 words, the world shifted. The storm that had carried Ava into their lives finally broke apart, leaving only the fragile, brilliant light of something new. The wedding was not the kind that splashed across glossy magazines or business sections. There were no crystal chandeliers or designer gowns borrowed from famous houses. Ethan had offered her all of that. He could have filled a ballroom with roses, hired photographers to sell the image of perfection, but Ava had only shaken her head. I don't want a performance, she told him. I want a beginning. So they chose the park where Lily liked to chase pigeons on Saturday mornings, a green stretch of grass bordered by oaks that swayed gently in the wind. The day dawned warm and clear, sunlight breaking across the city like a promise. Ava stood beneath an arch of wildflowers, her simple ivory dress fluttering against her ankles. She had braided her hair herself, with Lily's clumsy fingers weaving little paper foxes into the strands, taped together with a child's determination. When she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror that morning, she didn't see a woman playing dress-up in her sister's clothes anymore. She saw someone who belonged, someone who had survived storms and walked into light. Guests gathered slowly, family friends, a handful of board members who respected Ethan enough not to make a spectacle. A scattering of children from the foundation Hale and Rowan had begun funding in honor of Ethan's late wife. It was not a crowd of critics or reporters. It was a circle of people who mattered. Ava looked across them and felt her throat tighten. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about how much she didn't have. She was thinking about how much she was about to gain. Lily stole the show, of course. She wore a pale yellow dress that puffed like sunshine and carried a basket of paper foxes she had folded with Ava's help over the past week. Instead of flower petals, she scattered the little foxes along the aisle, giggling when the breeze lifted them and made them dance. Her hair glowed like bronze in the sunlight, and when she reached the arch, she clutched Ethan's hand proudly, as though this day was hers too. Ethan stood waiting, his dark hair catching the light, his brown eyes fixed only on Ava. He wore no mask, no armor, just a quiet steadiness that made her knees weak. When she reached him, he took her hand, curling his fingers around hers as if they had been meant to fit together all along. The vows were simple. They didn't need elaborate promises. The weight of what they had already endured made every word heavier than gold. Ethan's voice was steady but rough, breaking only when he said, I vow never to let you carry the storms alone again. Ava's hands trembled as she answered, and I vow to stay, even when it's hard, because you and Lily are worth everything. Lily tugged at Ava's dress then, looking up with wide eyes, and Ava bent low to let the girl whisper, Don't forget me. So Ava added with a tearful smile, "And I vow to be the mother Lily already believes I am." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan leaned down and kissed her. Not the careful, restrained kisses he had given before, but a kiss that was full, claiming, and tender all at once. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Ava only heard Lily's delighted laughter as she bounced between them, tugging at their hands until all three of them were holding one another. Afterward, there was lemonade instead of champagne, waffles from a food truck instead of a catered feast. Children ran barefoot across the grass, chasing the paper foxes that kept escaping into the wind. Ethan, who had spent years mastering every detail of his empire, let himself be pulled into silly games, his expensive shoes damp with grass, his laughter loud and unrestrained. Ava stood watching him at one point, her heart swelling at the sight of a man who had once been nothing but headlines and stone, now spinning his daughter in circles until both of them collapsed, breathless, into the grass. But the true shock, the one that struck Ava with the force of fate itself, came weeks later at a charity gala. The foundation had hosted an event to showcase the work being done with children in need. Ava wandered through the exhibits, her hand resting on the gentle curve of Ethan's arm, when she stopped abruptly before a framed photograph displayed on an easel. It was an old image from a fundraiser years ago, a little girl with chestnut hair staring shyly at the camera, her hand clutching a stuffed rabbit. Ava knew that picture. She remembered it because she had stayed up all night during her college years, moderating the online donation drive that helped fund that child's rehabilitation program. She had never known her name. She turned slowly toward Ethan, her heart hammering. "This is Lily," she whispered, her finger trembling against the glass. Ethan glanced at the photo, his brow furrowing, then softened. "Yes, one of the first campaigns after her mother." His voice faded, but Ava hardly heard, because she remembered now. She remembered sitting in her tiny dorm room, eyes gritty with exhaustion, answering comment after comment from strangers donating small sums, adding them up, hoping desperately that the child in the photo would get her chance. She had whispered a prayer for that little girl once, years before she'd ever stepped into Ethan's world. And now that same girl was sleeping each night down the hall, her paper foxes scattered across Ava's floor. The realization hit her like lightning. Fate had not brought her into Ethan's life by accident. Their paths had crossed long before either of them had known it. A year later, their home was no longer quiet, no longer lonely. The refrigerator was covered in charts Lily drew herself, stickers crookedly placed beside Ava's grocery list. Ethan had built a wooden playhouse in the yard, his hands clumsy with tools but determined, and every Saturday morning it filled with children from the neighborhood. Ava often found herself sitting on the porch with a book while Lily climbed in and out of the playhouse, her laughter ringing like bells, and Ethan came to sit beside her, his hand always reaching for hers as though the gesture had become instinct. Sometimes the storm still came, sudden, violent, with thunder that rattled the windows. But when they did, Ethan would close the shutters, Ava would pour cocoa into 3 mismatched mugs, and Lily would curl up between them on the couch. "It's okay," she would whisper now, no longer silent, her voice soft but steady. "We're together." And Ava would meet Ethan's gaze over their daughter's head, her heart full, and know it was true. What had begun as a substitution, a mistake, a lie spun from her sister's carelessness, had become the most truthful thing in her life. What had begun as fear had become strength. What had begun as silence had become love. And what had begun as a storm had ended in a family that would never let go of one another again. What makes this ending powerful is how it ties every thread of pain and chance into something inevitable, almost fated. Ava begins as a stand-in, someone who has spent her life overlooked and undervalued, but by the end she becomes the anchor of a family that had been broken. The detail of her once helping Lily years earlier, without even knowing it, feels like destiny quietly working in the background. Proof that sometimes the choices we make in obscurity ripple forward into miracles we could never have predicted. Ethan's transformation is equally striking. A man defined by control and solitude, he discovers that strength isn't about holding the world at arm's length, but about letting someone close enough to share the weight. His vulnerability in the final chapters, letting Ava see the cracks, letting Lily's voice heal him, gives the story its emotional gravity. The beauty of the conclusion lies not in the wedding or the resolution of scandals, but in the simple domestic imagery. Storms outside, cocoa in mismatched mugs, a little girl whispering, "We're together." It's a reminder that the grand arcs of love and power mean nothing if they don't lead to small, ordinary moments where safety and belonging finally exist. For me, the ending doesn't just close the story, it suggests a life beyond it, where the family continues to grow, laugh, and weather storms together. And that sense of continuity, the promise that love built on honesty and sacrifice doesn't fade when the curtain falls, is what makes the finale both satisfying and deeply hopeful.